One of the things that struck me last night about the Mike Flynn sentencing document that we got from Mueller's office last night is that it is so almost unequivocally positive about Mike Flynn and the cooperation that he has offered the special counsel's office. And yes, the special counsel's office does describe Mike Flynn's criminal behavior and says that that behavior is serious. But when it comes to his interactions with the special counsel's office since Flynn pled guilty and agreed to cooperate, in this document, the special counsel just could not be more uniformly and unequivocally delighted when it comes to his performance. With how quickly he cooperated, how completely, the truthfulness of the information he provided, how helpful it was for other investigations. Even as they say, he provided crucial information that aided multiple investigations that are still ongoing, investigations that can't be disclosed to the public, that are redacted in these public-facing filings that we got last night. They are still so happy with the information they got from Mike Flynn that they don't want to delay his sentencing any longer, even as these cases are still pending. They want the judge to put this matter to rest for good old Mike Flynn. He has been an ideal cooperator. This is not how the special counsel's office usually talks about targets and witnesses in this case. Right? I mean, in terms of other people associated with the Trump campaign, for example, Trump campaign chair Paul Manafort, in his case, the special counsel's office told the court that Manafort was a terrible cooperator. He had breached his cooperation agreement. He had lied. They didn't intend to keep their end of the bargain anymore either, and they're going to lay out his lies and everything bad he ever did in his life in a filing we expect by the end of the week. In the case of George Papadopoulos, a Trump campaign advisor, the special counsel's office went out of its way to say that Papadopoulos did not provide substantial assistance to them. He did not provide useful information. And by the way, he dragged his feet and was slow about everything that he did offer, so he wasn't much help. The contrast with their praise for what they got out of Flynn just could not be more stark. So here's my question about Flynn, and one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to Congressman Adam Schiff from the Intelligence Committee tonight. Why is Trump so consistently psyched about Mike Flynn? I mean, you know, Michael Cohen has also apparently become a fulsome cooperator with the special counsel's office. The president now can barely move his thumbs without tweeting something disparaging and undermining about Michael Cohen, insulting him, right? Giving him derogatory nicknames, going so far as to publicly call on the judge in the Cohen case to throw the book at Michael Cohen and give him the maximum sentence. Because Michael Cohen is cooperating, and that's terrible. You know, but not a peep about Mike Flynn. Not at all, since Flynn pled guilty and became a cooperator more than a year ago. And not even since the nature of Flynn's cooperation was made public, which is now more than 24 hours ago. And this extends a pretty remarkable streak by Donald Trump when it comes to Mike Flynn. And it has always seemed a little bit curious, but now it actually seems incredible. Not incredible as in fantastic, but incredible as in not credible. As in there must be something else going on here. There's more than meets the eye. Why has Trump been so invested in defending and only consistently praising and never criticizing Mike Flynn from the very beginning? Why has he gone so far out of his way to only have positive things to say and do and only have things to offer Mike Flynn? When President-elect Trump, 2 days after the election, went to the White House to meet with then-President Barack Obama, we were told that President Obama warned Trump about two specific things. He warned him that North Korea would be a very serious national security matter that he wouldn't be able to avoid dealing with. And in addition to North Korea, multiple sources reported that the other warning that Obama gave Trump was about Mike Flynn. That Obama told Trump specifically, don't hire Mike Flynn for anything sensitive or for anything particularly high-ranking. Take my advice, not that guy. That's my one warning besides North Korea. Nevertheless, Trump decided that he would name Mike Flynn as National Security Advisor anyway. Then, during the transition, before Trump was sworn in, Mike Flynn's lawyers sent up another red flag. They notified the Trump transition that Flynn, in fact, was under federal investigation for having secretly acted as an agent of a foreign power during the campaign, as an agent of the Turkish government, even though he hadn't declared himself as such. So he's being considered for National Security Advisor. His lawyers say he's the subject of an active federal criminal investigation. Nevertheless, despite that notification, Trump remained intent that he would name Flynn his National Security Advisor. Then, also during the transition, a minor crisis arose involving Mike Flynn and his devotion to his son, Mike Jr. Mike Flynn Jr., during the transition, continued what had been a string of embarrassing and offensive public behavior, which led to questions about why Mike Flynn Jr. was serving in the Trump transition and why, in fact, the Trump transition had applied for a security clearance for this kid. The head of the Trump transition was Vice President-elect Mike Pence. He publicly denied that Mike Flynn's son was any part of the transition. Turns out Mike Flynn's son was. So that was an embarrassing thing to Vice President-elect Pence to have been called out about. Reporters immediately called him on the fact that if Flynn Jr. wasn't on the transition, why was he emailing them all from an official Trump transition email address? So that was profoundly embarrassing during the transition. And specifically for Mike Pence, who was supposedly running the transition. He never was able to come up with an explanation for why Mike Flynn's son had been put up for a security clearance by the transition. Pence appeared to not even know that he was there, let alone that he'd been put forward for something like that. But nevertheless, even after that embarrassment, the administration still went forward with plans to name Mike Flynn National Security Advisor. Then as soon as the administration started, 4 days after Trump was sworn in, the red flags turned into giant waving red banners that occluded the view from the House because they draped from the roof to the ground. 4 days after Trump was sworn in, the Trump White House got that extraordinary warning from the Justice Department that Flynn wasn't just all these other things they'd learned about and been told to worry about and had problems with when it had come to him already. Flynn, in fact, was compromised by the Russian government. And the clear implication of that dramatic, unprecedented warning that the National Security Advisor was compromised by a hostile foreign power, the clear implication of that warning was that they needed to get that guy out of there, out of the White House immediately. Huge national security risk. They certainly needed to cut off his access to classified information since the government of Russia had compromised him. And the implication of that is they could get anything out of him that they wanted. Don't let him have access to any important classified information. My God. Nevertheless, the Trump White House didn't react at all. Apparently, they didn't react privately. They didn't react publicly. They kept him on another 18 days, and they let him retain his access to highly classified information. No urgency to get him out of there whatsoever, no alarm, no worries. And then when the public reporting about this crisis continued, and they finally had to give in and allow him to resign, the president praised him publicly. And then the very next day, the president immediately went to the FBI director and told the FBI director he needed to quash the FBI investigation into Mike Flynn. Told the FBI director that the FBI needed to drop it with Mike Flynn. Thereafter, President Trump also went to the director of national intelligence, Dan Coats, and reportedly told him, too, he needed to intercede with the FBI, quash the investigation into Mike Flynn. Thereafter, one of the president's lawyers, John Dowd, reportedly went to Mike Flynn and offered him a presidential pardon. Why? I mean, what explains this elaborate routine of back bends, back flips, layout, reverse handsprings? I mean, they're not just sticking up for Mike Flynn. They're insisting on Mike Flynn. They're insisting on the necessity of Mike Flynn. They're making every excuse for Mike Flynn. It's not 3 strikes, you're out. It's like 330 strikes, you're still in. I mean, the president risked criminal exposure himself by intervening with the FBI to try to get leniency specifically for Mike Flynn. Why? Out of loyalty? Because Mike Flynn had been involved in the Trump campaign? Yeah, tell that to Jeff Sessions if you think that's a guarantee of Trump's lifelong loyalty towards you, right? Once you start to get him in trouble or otherwise annoy him. Tell that to Steve Bannon, or as Trump now calls him, Sloppy Steve, who's lost his mind. Yeah, he's real loyal to everybody who helped him in his campaign. What is it about Mike Flynn specifically that has made Trump go to the ends of the earth for him? That has kept Trump from ever talking smack about him, even now? Honestly, don't you think it's weird that Trump still has not talked smack about Mike Flynn, not even now? Not even after we learned that Mike Flynn did 19 different interviews with the special counsel's office and left them so pleased with the information he had to offer that he's going to do no jail time himself, and they just did a sentencing memo that basically calls him a saint and says he's awesome and they couldn't have done it without him? Not a peep from Trump about that? I mean, the only other dude who Trump is so consistently positive about and refuses to ever criticize, no matter the cost, the only other person he treats like this is freaking Putin. So what does that tell us about what has just gone down here with Mike Flynn in the special counsel's office? And what is Flynn's sentencing going to lead to next? The person who is perhaps best situated to answer that question in the country, other than Mueller himself, is Congressman Adam Schiff, and he joins us next.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.